Hello and welcome back to my video for making asteroids in Unity. This is video 6.2, and it's a supplemental video where I take a look at adding a graphical user face element to indicate the progress of my skill cooldown. So this is after I've started to design a rapid fire skill, which you can see me activating here, which increases the fire rate of my weapons. But I don't ever know when it's able to be used again. I can sit here hitting Q, and then all of a sudden it's active again after 10 seconds. But as the player, I don't really know when that is. I have no visual indicator of when my skill is ready to use again. So that's the goal of this video, is to take a look at making some kind of MOBA-looking skill icon that indicates the progress of the cooldown of the skill. And so a few things to note. This is I've already implemented some of the steps that I've written about, such as adding a new particle system to indicate the activation of the skill, setting up the variables of the skill duration. You can see that there's a new child object here that has the skill particles. And then also most of the coding has already been done to get it to work. So you could see that it was actually activating and providing rapid fire. There's one thing that I do want to note that I don't think I mentioned in the written component, and that is I have to change how I find my engine particle component during the player ship start method. Because now there's two children that have particle systems, I can no longer do a reliable search for it. So I can either just switch it to being a public variable and bind that component directly onto the prefab, or I would have to switch this to a searching by name rather than searching in the children. Both of those would be fine. I think overall, I think it's a little bit quicker just to attach it as a variable, because then it doesn't have to execute a search for game objects. So I think you might get slightly better performance out of that. And so let's take a look at setting up the graphic for this skill. Now that we've got all the code working, we can see here I've got in my update acknowledgement of pressing the keys for the skills and it activating. And then down here I've got my methods to let other parts of the program detect if I've activated my skill. I've got my isRapidFire method that says true or false if it's rapid fire is turned on. And then an alternate method where I actually create a list of strings that indicate that the buffs that I have active. If I really wanted to get crazy about this, I could have made a separate data type for buffs and debuffs and make the list out of those data types. But I figured for a project of this scope, it might just be easier just to use strings, and wherever it may need to detect that, it'll just search for the string and use that instead. And so that's the code component of this, of these different pieces. But let's talk graphics. Now, I've already altered a existing image to serve as this skill icon, which we can see here. This is this Skill UI Blaster and Skill UI Blaster background. I started with finding a graphic for the skill icon, and then in Photoshop or in GIMP, I added a border around it. So this image is actually slightly larger. You can see that the size is 288 by 288, and this one is 256 by 256. So we're going to have to play around with that to make sure that it looks good. But first, we need to even get these into my project. So I'm going to select them and drag and drop them into my textures folder. It should import those without any hassle. And we've got inside of here my Skill UI Blaster and Skill UI background. But we want these to be images that are going to be displayed on the UI. And so we actually need to switch their texture type from being just a default texture to being a sprite, so that it treats it as a true 2D image rather than trying to use it as a texture for a surface. So choose sprite. You'll see that it brings up a whole bunch of other options that we actually don't really need to worry about here. there are different features, and if we were to look at a 2D game, we could talk about when you would want to use these. Most notable, there's pixels per unit, which controls the size of this sprite if you're making a 2D game. We are not, so it's not going to be a big issue, although for the sake of argument, I do maybe want to make it like 32, just because I like powers of 2 for graphics. And then we need to make sure we click apply here to make sure it commits. Then we need to do the same thing to the skill background. You'll actually notice that it adds like an extra component here indicating that it's a sprite. And so we want to make this a sprite, and I just set this to 32 just because in a lot of 2D applications I'm used to using powers of 2 for the pixels per unit. Then hit apply, and it commits it to being a sprite. So we need to add an image. So basically the idea is that I have a lighter skill and a darker grayed out skill, and I'm going to have 2 images stacked on top of each other and adjust how much of the lighter skill is being shown. So let's set that system up and see it in action. So with the canvas selected for my UI, I'm going to go to Game Object, UI, Image, and it inserts this jumbo image. At this point, we probably want to switch over to Game View just to see what the UI is kind of looking like right now. And it has some very strange X and Y settings. So let's just set those to 0. And let's anchor it in the bottom right of the screen. I think I want my skills down there. So I click on the rectangle transform option, and then I hold down Alt and Shift so that it moves its center to this bottom right. And I'm going to bring it in a little bit up off of the side. So let's make this the background image. So let's go with an X position of -20 because we're moving left, and then we're moving up, so +20. So that way it's relative to the sides there. The width, I don't have a definitive set here yet, and you can actually change this around. But in my testing, I wanted to go 72 by 72. And we'll look at some of the math behind that in a second. I'm going to rename this from image to skill background, and then push enter. Now we need to actually pick the graphic. Right now it's just a white square. So under source image, we can click the little dot right here and choose this background blaster looking thing. And so we've got that icon sitting there in the corner. We don't need to change any of these other settings. And so if we hit play, we can see that it's down there. It's sitting on top of the world. All right, so now let's put the foreground image in as well, because the foreground is going to be what we're actually going to be manipulating. So let's go to Game Object, UI, and add a image. This image is going to be the foreground of everything, so I'm going to rename it to Skill Foreground. And I'm going to drag it so that it becomes a child of the skill background. And you'll see that it's going to move its centering on top of there. Well, it didn't, because it updated the X and Y position so that it stays in the middle. But if we set the X and Y position to 0, 0, we can see it jumping over on top of this. And from here, we could change the size. Now, if this background was 72 by 72, I came up with that by taking the actual image size and dividing it by 4. So if the other image, if my foreground image is 256 by 256, and I divide that by 4 to get the same scale factor, it's going to be 64 units. So let's go and do that. Make the skill foreground 64 by 64. And we should see that it looks reasonably centered, and that's because we've actually used this rectangle transform is being centered in the center. So it's putting it in the middle of the thing here. And let's go load the sprite and pick Skill UI Blaster. And this is where we get the gimmick out of it. And that is being able to change how it fills. That's under the image type. We want to use filled. And this gives us the ability to adjust how visible it is. And you can see what it looks like right here, if we think that that's going to work. However, when the skill is ready, it's going to look like this. And when the skill is not ready, it immediately jumps down to 0 and slowly refills back in like this. So we will want to uncheck clockwise. So that way this looks more like kind of a traditional skill refill. You can take a look at the other fill methods. None of them are really going to fit the bill for what we want. I mean, if you want a horizontal one, that one's kind of neat. Some games use the vertical fills. So when you use it, it goes down like this, and then it slowly fills back up like that. So, you know, choose whatever one strikes your fancy. And just know that it's going to jump to a value of 0 and then fill back up as the skill becomes increasingly ready. All right, so we've got that set up there. Skill foreground is named, and there's nothing else we really need to do here. At this point, we've got to start coding the ability to interact with this. So that will take us to the level manager. I chose the level manager because it was already handling most of the interfacing of the UI elements anyway, so it makes sense that I should probably interface with this image type inside of level manager as well. And we can call it skill image. And that is what we're going to actually link it to. So let's give it a new method here. Towards the end, I'm going to add it right after change enemy count. I'm going to add a new method that's going to let me interact with this UI skill. Public void update skill. Let's call it update skill. No, we'll call it update skill UI. And then it's going to take two parameters, the cooldown remaining and the cooldown max, because we're going to have to calculate the ratio of how progressed the skill is cooled down. Because if you actually look at how this thing's going to fill, it's on a scale of 0 to 1. So we're going to have to figure out what percentage, how progressed the skill is from being cooled down. So let's go with if the skill image is not equal to null. Just add some protection there just in case it decides to get dereferenced for some reason. Skill image, and that variable is called fill amount. So fill amount equals 1 minus the cooldown remaining divided by the cooldown max. And that should provide us with how filled it should be. So basically the idea is we're 100% filled when the cooldown remaining is 0, meaning the skill is ready. Then when we use the skill, the cooldown remaining will be set to like 10 seconds. The cooldown max is 10 seconds. And so 10 divided by 10 is 1. 1 minus 1 would be 0, meaning you have a 0 fill. So this would be the formula to create the filling that we want. And so all we really need to do now is just have the player ship call this method every time it updates the status of the cooldown. And let's add one more thing, just to kind of continue some of what I was doing here with my looking up of elements. I'm going to directly bind it anyway, but we could do skill image equals game object dot find skill foreground .getComponentImage. Be very careful when you're using this, because if you've changed the capitalization or misspelled this in any way from what it's called up here, you will end up with a null pointer error, and that's kind of problematic. Alright, so let's hit save. And my cats are excited to see this thing in action. Let's make sure we save our project. Well, I guess we need to actually put it into the player for it to work. So let's bind it while we're here. So going to the game manager, we can see we've got this new slot for skill image. So I want to take skill image foreground into there and attach it. Now to the player. So we will return to the player ship script, and I'm going to handle this during update. And right after I modify the skill cooldown, I'm going to send the message to the manager to update the icon. Now, if you recall in a previous video, we actually added a variable for the manager, so we don't have to search for it. We can just say manager dots, and then the method that we just created was just update skill UI. The first parameter is the remaining cooldown, so skill cooldown remaining, comma. The second parameter is the max cooldown, and I think I made a variable for that called skill cooldown max. Alright, and so that's going to call it every time it's cooling down. But one other case may occur, and that's when the ship is destroyed. So let's take a look to see what this looks like when that occurs. So let's hit save all on my scripts. We can return to here, hit play. And when we hit Q, let's watch down here to see what happens. When I hit Q right now, you can see that rapid fire activated, and the skill cooldown is progressing. I can't activate the skill again until that is filled. And then you can see that it worked. But if I were to destroy my ship, the skill cooldown does reset, and we're able to kind of continue. Now, it is resetting in that specific case because it's doing if the skill cooldown remaining is greater than or equal to 0. So there's some thought to whether or not maybe we should have just made this greater than 0 so that it's not sitting there running this every frame. And I'm doing the same for skill active. And then I'm just going to take this manager update line, and in the start method, immediately after respawning, I'm going to put it in here. And let's just see why. If I change this to just be greater than 0, when I crash into something, my skill won't reset itself. We can see that that's like frozen half cooldown. And so if I put inside of starts, if I just put the call to re-update that skill UI, well, when my ship respawns, the cooldown remaining is going to be 0, so it's going to be back to being filled. But that way, we're not every frame attempting to run this. Now, I assume it may not run every frame because it is going to subtract time.delta time, but this is a more proper structure to update it when you respawn to clear out the old status. Because you'd want to do something like that if you had like currently selected weapon icons or other things. And we see that that properly reset. And in this, the last thing I really want to do is tweak the fire rate, which I think is in the prefab, of that multi-shot. Oh, that's the spark. There we go. 1.25. So this is causing an issue, and so that's, you know, you should always check your console, and that's because it's trying to find this, but this was null, and so I don't think it's using it. And it's because I misspelled foreground, which is what I was cautioning about, was be mindful of if you misspell that, you may end up with this null reference exception. So we're console free, and we can see that things work out whenever I activate the skill cooldown. And so that's how you can actually add MOBA style icons to a game. And that can really add a lot of cool features to your game. It gives the player really neat feedback to look at. So that wraps this video up. So thank you for watching, and I hope you have a lot of fun adding skills to your game.